The autumn sun hung low over Camp Hearn, Texas, on the afternoon of October 15, 1943, when a group of German prisoners of war filed through the gates under armed escort. They were heading to something the American guards called a rodeo, a word none of them had heard before. These men, most of them veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, had surrendered in Tunisia just months earlier. They had crossed an ocean in the holds of Liberty ships, travelled by train through landscapes so vast they seemed impossible, and now found themselves in a place that bore no resemblance to any battlefield they had known. The guards were grinning, joking among themselves in that casual American way the prisoners found both unsettling and oddly reassuring. One of the Germans, a former sergeant named Klaus Becker, would later write in his diary that he assumed they were being taken to observe some kind of cavalry training exercise. After all, what else would involve horses, dust, and assembled crowds of military personnel? What Becker and his fellow prisoners witnessed that afternoon would fundamentally challenge their understanding of American military culture, national character, and the very nature of the war they had been fighting. They expected to see mounted soldiers practicing maneuvers. Instead, they saw something that seemed to defy military logic entirely. Men risking their lives for no apparent tactical purpose, crowds cheering for individual achievement rather than unit cohesion, and a celebration of danger that served no strategic objective. The confusion on their faces was so evident that one American guard later recalled asking a German prisoner what he thought of the show. The prisoner responded in halting English. This misunderstanding, this collision between German military expectations and American cultural reality, reveals something profound about the two nations at war. For the German prisoners, everything was supposed to serve the state, the military, the collective war effort. Entertainment and military function were not separate categories in their worldview. How could Americans afford to waste time, resources, and risk injury on something that served no military purpose? The answer to that question, and the prisoners' gradual comprehension of what a rodeo actually represented, would become for many of them the first crack in the ideological foundation of everything they had been taught about America, about warfare, and about the inevitable triumph of German arms. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why these German soldiers misread the rodeo so completely, we must first understand who they were and what they had been taught. The men of the Afrika Korps were not the fanatical SS troops of popular imagination. Most were regular Wehrmacht soldiers, conscripts and volunteers who had believed, at least initially, in the Nazi narrative of German superiority and American weakness. They had been told repeatedly that Americans were soft, individualistic, and incapable of the collective sacrifice necessary for modern warfare. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry had spent years painting a picture of the United States as a mongrel nation, divided by class and race, more interested in Hollywood fantasies and consumer goods than in the harsh realities of total war. The propaganda was not entirely without basis in selective observation. America in the 1930s had indeed been racked by the Great Depression, labor strikes, and social unrest. German intelligence had monitored American reluctance to enter the war, the isolationist movements, the America First rallies. They had collected photographs of breadlines and Hoovervilles. They had documented the racial segregation that divided the American South. All of this fed into a narrative that became gospel within the German military. America might have industrial capacity, but it lacked the will, the unity, and the martial spirit necessary to defeat the disciplined forces of the Third Reich. This narrative was reinforced by the structure of German military culture itself. The Wehrmacht emphasized hierarchy, obedience, and the subordination of individual desire to collective purpose. Entertainment for German soldiers was carefully managed, organized performances, mandatory political education sessions, communal singing of approved songs. The idea of soldiers or citizens engaging in dangerous activities purely for personal glory and public entertainment would have struck German military planners as wasteful at best, subversive at worst. Recreation was meant to restore fighting efficiency, not to celebrate individual risk-taking outside the context of military necessity. When the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia in May of 1943, more than 275,000 Axis troops fell into Allied hands. For the Americans, this created an immediate logistical crisis. The United States had never held large numbers of foreign prisoners of war. The War Department had to rapidly construct a network of camps across the country, and Texas, with its vast open spaces and climate similar to North Africa, became a primary destination. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners be housed in conditions similar to those of the capturing army and in climates comparable to where they were captured. Thus, German soldiers who had fought in the deserts of Libya and Tunisia found themselves in the deserts and prairies of Texas. The camps themselves were hastily constructed, but substantial. Camp Hearn, established in late 1942 in Robertson County, eventually held more than 4,800 prisoners. It consisted of over 250 buildings, spread across 700 acres, surrounded by double barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and floodlights. Yet, despite the security measures, the camps bore little resemblance to the harsh conditions the Germans had expected. The barracks were wooden structures with proper roofs, heating, and ventilation. Prisoners received 3 meals a day that, by German wartime standards, were lavish. They had access to canteens where they could purchase tobacco, toiletries, and other goods with the 80 cents per day they earned for voluntary labor. They could receive mail from home, send letters under certain restrictions, and even attend educational classes. The contrast with conditions in Germany was stark and, for many prisoners, deeply unsettling. By late 1943, German civilians were enduring increasingly severe rationing. Allied bombing raids were devastating cities, and the Eastern Front was consuming men and materiel at a horrifying rate. Letters from home spoke of hunger, fear, and loss. Yet here in Texas, enemy prisoners were eating white bread, fresh meat, and vegetables daily. They were sleeping in heated buildings, playing soccer on organized fields, and watching American movies on Saturday nights. Some prisoners called it the Fritz Ritz, a bitter joke that acknowledged the cognitive dissonance of their situation. How could the soft Americans be winning the war if they could afford to treat enemy prisoners so well? The answer, of course, lay in America's massive industrial and agricultural capacity, a capacity that German intelligence had consistently underestimated. While Germany struggled to feed its population and military, the United States was producing such agricultural surpluses that feeding prisoners of war created no meaningful strain on the system. The camps weren't acts of charity. They were simply the natural byproduct of an economy operating at unprecedented levels of output. Every Liberty ship that carried prisoners to America returned to Europe loaded with the tanks, trucks, aircraft, and supplies that were grinding down the Wehrmacht. But this reality was difficult for prisoners to grasp, especially in the early months of their captivity. Their ideological training had not prepared them for abundance in the land of the enemy. It was into this context of confusion and cognitive dissonance that the rodeo invitation arrived. The Texas prison rodeo at Huntsville had been running since 1931, and by the 1940s, it had become a major regional event, drawing tens of thousands of spectators every October. Prison officials had discovered that allowing select prisoners of war to attend local events served multiple purposes. It provided a reward for good behavior, it helped alleviate the crushing boredom of camp life, and it offered opportunities for the re-education program that American authorities were beginning to implement. The theory was that exposing German prisoners to American life, its prosperity, its diversity, its apparent contradictions, would begin to erode their faith in Nazi ideology. For the prisoners boarding the trucks that October afternoon, the trip itself was revelatory. The roads were paved and well maintained. They passed farms with modern tractors sitting in fields, houses with electric lights visible even in daylight, automobiles that seemed to be everywhere despite the war. One prisoner later wrote that he had expected America to show visible signs of strain from the war effort, empty roads, darkened buildings, evidence of rationing and sacrifice. Instead, everything seemed normal, abundant, functioning. This was not what they had been told to expect. The prison at Huntsville was itself an oddity. The German prisoners watched as American convicts, men imprisoned for crimes against their own society, were being organized for what appeared to be some kind of military exercise. The prisoners saw the bulls and horses in pens, the riding equipment being prepared, the crowds gathering in wooden stands. The logical assumption, given their military training and worldview, was that this was cavalry preparation. Perhaps these convicts were being trained for military service as punishment or as a path to redemption. Perhaps this was how America dealt with its criminal class, by militarizing them. The German military had historical precedents for such thinking. Prussian military tradition included the concept of penal battalions, Strafbataillon, where soldiers guilty of offences were sent to perform especially dangerous duties. The idea that a nation might use convicts for military purposes was not foreign to German thinking. What they were about to witness, however, would shatter that interpretation entirely. When the rodeo began, the German prisoners watched in silent confusion as the first cowboy mounted a bronco. The horse exploded from the chute, bucking and twisting with violent force. The rider lasted, perhaps 6 seconds before being thrown into the dust. The crowd roared with approval. Another rider entered the arena. The same violent dance. The same result. Over and over, men mounted animals that seemed designed to throw them, with no apparent objective beyond staying mounted for a few seconds. There were no formations, no unit cohesion, no officers directing tactics. Each man competed individually, and the crowd cheered whether the rider succeeded or failed, as long as the attempt was spectacular. Klaus Becker, watching from the stands, turned to a fellow prisoner and asked in German, "What is the military purpose of this?" His companion, a former corporal named Wilhelm Strasser, could only shake his head. They watched as the bull riding began even more violent, even more apparently pointless. Men were being thrown into the air, landing hard, sometimes limping from the arena while the crowd applauded. One prisoner asked an American guard why the men were being punished. The guard laughed and explained that they weren't being punished, they were volunteering for this. They wanted to do it. For money, certainly, but more importantly, for glory, for pride, for the respect of their peers and the crowd. This explanation made no sense within the German prisoners' framework of understanding. Why would men volunteer for injury? Why would a crowd celebrate individual risk-taking that served no collective purpose? And most baffling of all, why would the American military establishment, for surely this event required official approval and resources, allow such waste? The confusion deepened as the rodeo continued. The German prisoners observed events that seemed to grow progressively more chaotic and dangerous. In the hard money event, inmates competed to snatch a tobacco sack filled with cash from between the horns of an angry bull. Men sprinted across the arena, dodging the animal's charges, risking trampling and goring for what appeared to be small amounts of currency. The crowd screamed encouragement. Some inmates succeeded, holding their prize aloft, while the bull chased them to the fence. Others were knocked down, forced to scramble away while rodeo clowns distracted the animal. Becker noted in his diary that evening, "Today we witnessed what the Americans call a rodeo. The men risk serious injury for small rewards and the approval of strangers. There is no apparent training value. The techniques used would be useless in cavalry combat. The horses and bulls are not being trained for any military purpose, quite the opposite. They are selected and encouraged to be uncontrollable. I asked the guard if these men were volunteers or if this was a form of punishment. He assured me they were volunteers. Some had been competing for years. I do not understand this country." The misunderstanding was not universal among the prisoners. Some had travelled more widely before the war, had read more extensively, or were simply more observant. These men began to piece together what they were seeing. This was entertainment, pure and simple. It was a cultural tradition from the American West, a celebration of cowboy mythology that was woven through American popular culture. It had nothing to do with military training. But even for those who grasped the basic nature of the rodeo, questions remained. How could a nation at war afford such frivolity? How could it allow men, even prisoners, to risk injury in activities unrelated to the war effort? And what did it mean that thousands of civilians would gather to watch this, would pay money to attend, would bring their families to see men risk their lives for no purpose beyond spectacle. The answers to these questions lay in fundamental differences between American and German societies, differences that went far deeper than the prisoners initially realized. The rodeo was not an aberration or a wartime morale event. It was a manifestation of values that had existed in American culture long before the war and would persist long after. The celebration of individual achievement, the romanticization of dangerous and economically irrational behavior, the clear separation between military function and civilian entertainment, these were not weaknesses in the American system. They were features, products of a society organized on fundamentally different principles than Nazi Germany. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German prisoners had been trained in a worldview where everything served the state. Recreation was valuable, insofar as it restored worker productivity or soldier effectiveness. Art was judged by its contribution to national morale or political indoctrination. Even sports were organized around the concept of national glory. The 1936 Berlin Olympics had been explicitly designed to demonstrate Aryan superiority. The idea that something could be valuable simply because people enjoyed it, that individuals might choose to do dangerous things for no reason beyond personal satisfaction, was alien to the totalitarian mindset. American culture, by contrast, had been built on a mythology of individualism that the rodeo perfectly embodied. The cowboy was a central figure in American folklore, the lone man facing nature and danger without support from collective institutions, succeeding or failing based on personal skill and courage. This mythology was economically irrational even in the 19th century American West, where the actual work of cattle ranching was far more mundane and cooperative than the dime novels suggested. But the mythology persisted because it reflected something Americans wanted to believe about themselves: that individual initiative and courage mattered, that a man could make his own destiny, that glory was available to anyone brave enough to take the risk. The rodeo transformed this mythology into public spectacle. It took the most dangerous moments of cowboy work, breaking wild horses, controlling cattle, and turned them into competitions where success was measured in seconds and determined by a combination of skill, courage, and luck. Importantly, Rodeo's success carried no official sanction. There were no government agencies promoting rodeo champions, no state apparatus claiming their victories for national glory. A rodeo cowboy was famous because other cowboys and spectators recognized his skill. His rewards came from the community, not from the state. For the German prisoners watching at Huntsville, this represented a category of human behavior they had not been taught to recognize. Under Nazi ideology, individual action was valuable only insofar as it served the Volk, the people, understood as a racial and national collective. A soldier's courage was meaningful because it contributed to German victory. A worker's productivity was important because it strengthened the nation. Art, sport, entertainment, all were evaluated based on their contribution to national power and racial purity. The concept that something could be valuable simply because free individuals chose to participate in it, free spectators chose to watch it, and the state merely permitted rather than directed it, was incomprehensible. As the rodeo continued, the German prisoners began to notice other details that reinforced their confusion. The inmates competing were of various races: white, black, Hispanic. In Nazi racial theory, this mixing was a sign of American degeneracy, the mongrel nation's fatal weakness. Yet here, men of different races competed under the same rules, received the same prizes, and earned the same respect from the crowd, based solely on their performance. One German prisoner later wrote to a family member, "The Americans allow their Negroes to compete with white men in public spectacles. We were told this was impossible in their segregated society. I am beginning to doubt many things we were told." This observation was particularly significant because the German prisoners had indeed witnessed American racial segregation. On the train journey from the East Coast to Texas, they had seen separate facilities for black and white Americans, separate train cars, separate waiting rooms. Some prisoners had noted this with satisfaction. seeing it as confirmation of what Nazi propaganda had taught them about American racial divisions. But the rodeo revealed a more complex reality. Yes, American society was racially segregated and deeply unjust. But within certain contexts, sports, competition, military service performance could sometimes transcend racial barriers in ways that German racial ideology claimed were impossible. The prisoners watched as the rodeo progressed through various events. Calf roping demonstrated the practical ranching skills that had given rise to rodeo competition. Steer wrestling showed techniques for controlling large animals. Barrel racing displayed horsemanship and speed. Each event had roots in actual cowboy work, but had been transformed into stylized competitions judged on time and technique. The prisoners with cavalry experience could see the skill involved and could recognize the horsemanship required. But they could not reconcile the skill with the apparent purposelessness. Why perfect these techniques when modern warfare had made cavalry obsolete? What the prisoners failed to understand was that Americans were perfectly capable of distinguishing between cultural tradition and military necessity. The United States military was not training cavalry in any significant numbers by 1943. American armor and mechanized infantry had learned the lessons of Poland and France. The army was producing tank battalions, motorized artillery, and airborne divisions. But this had nothing to do with whether civilians attended rodeos or whether the rodeo tradition continued. The two existed in separate spheres. Military necessity did not consume every aspect of civilian life, even in wartime. This separation was itself revealing. German society under the Nazis had been progressively militarized since 1933. The Hitler Youth prepared boys for military service from age 10. Women's organizations were structured around supporting the war effort. Leisure activities were monitored and directed by party organizations. The concept of a civilian sphere independent from state control had been systematically eliminated. The total war that Nazi leadership demanded was not just a military strategy, but a social reality. Every German was a soldier in the racial struggle, whether they wore a uniform or not. American society, by contrast, remained fundamentally civilian in character even during total war. Yes, the draft pulled millions of men into military service. Yes, the industry was reorganized for war production. Yes, rationing affected daily life. But underneath these wartime measures, the basic structure of American society remained unchanged. People still attended rodeos. Hollywood still made movies. Professional baseball continued, though with depleted rosters. The state directed economic resources toward military victory, but it did not claim total control over the lives and leisure of citizens. For the German prisoners, this represented a profound cognitive challenge. They had been taught that total war required total mobilization, that half measures and divided loyalties would lead to defeat. Yet here was America, apparently fighting a two-front global war while maintaining cultural traditions that served no military purpose, allowing dangerous entertainment that risked injury to potential workers and soldiers, and preserving a sphere of civilian life that answered to market forces and personal choice, rather than state diktat. And America was winning. As the rodeo ended and the German prisoners boarded the trucks back to Camp Herne, they carried with them a collection of disturbing observations and unsettled assumptions. The conversations on the return journey were muted, thoughtful. Some prisoners clung to the initial interpretation. Surely there must be some military training value they had missed, some deeper purpose the Americans were concealing. But others, particularly those who had been in captivity longer or who were more willing to question what they had been taught, began to articulate a more unsettling conclusion. Maybe the propaganda had been wrong. Not just wrong about the rodeo, but wrong about America more fundamentally. Klaus Becker spent that evening and the following days talking with other prisoners, comparing observations, trying to make sense of what they had seen. He noted that some prisoners became angry when their assumptions were challenged, accusing duptors of defeatism or betrayal. These were often the most ideologically committed Nazis, men who needed the propaganda narrative to remain intact because their entire worldview depended on it. but others, perhaps the majority, were simply confused. They had fought for Germany out of patriotism, duty, or because they had no choice. They were not fanatics, and for these men, the rodeo became a symbol of something larger and more troubling: the possibility that everything they had been told about the enemy was false. The re-education program that American authorities implemented in POW camps was designed to exploit exactly this kind of cognitive dissonance. The program was controversial and operated in a legal grey area. The Geneva Convention prohibited coercive indoctrination of prisoners, but American officials argued they were simply providing access to information that had been denied to Germans under Nazi censorship. Prisoners were shown American newspapers and magazines. They attended lectures on American history and democracy. They watched documentary films about Allied military victories and, eventually, about the liberation of concentration camps. The rodeo visit was not officially part of the re-education program, but it served a similar function. It exposed prisoners to aspects of American life that contradicted the Nazi narrative: the abundance, the racial complexity, the individualism, the separation of civilian and military spheres. All of these challenged the totalitarian worldview. And because prisoners had seen these things with their own eyes rather than being told about them by captors, the impact was more profound than any lecture could achieve. Over the following months, Becker's diary entries reveal a gradual transformation in his thinking. He began noting other contradictions. The American guards were friendly when prisoners cooperated, joking and sometimes sharing cigarettes. Yet these same guards would shoot without hesitation if a prisoner approached the fence line. The contradiction puzzled him until he realized it was not a contradiction at all. Americans distinguished between persons and roles in a way German military culture did not. A guard could be friendly with a prisoner as one human to another while still being absolutely committed to preventing escape as a matter of duty. The person was not the role. He noticed that American officers did not expect or receive the kind of rigid deference that German officers demanded. Enlisted men addressed officers with respect, but without servility. Decisions were sometimes questioned or discussed rather than simply obeyed. Yet American units functioned effectively, perhaps more effectively than German units, where questioning an order could result in severe punishment. How was this possible? How could an army function without the rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience that German military theory claimed were essential? He observed American prisoners working alongside German prisoners in the camp workshops and farms. Some Americans were German-speaking children of immigrants or men who had studied the language. These men sometimes talked with the German prisoners about their lives before the war, their families, their hopes for after the war. Becker was struck by how ordinary they were, how similar to his own family and neighbors back home. This was the enemy? These farmers and factory workers who talked about baseball and complained about army food? Where were the plutocratic warmongers and Jewish conspirators that Goebbels had promised? The psychological crisis that some prisoners experienced was not primarily about military defeat. By late 1943, most German soldiers understood that the war was not going as promised. The Eastern Front was a horror. North Africa was lost. Italy was collapsing. Defeat was becoming imaginable. But defeat was a military question. What the rodeo and the broader American experience revealed was more fundamental: the entire ideological framework within which they had understood the war might be false. If America was not the weak, divided, mongrel nation they had been told about, if Americans were not the inferior people that Nazi racial theory insisted they were, then what did that mean about Germany? About the causes they had fought for? About the years of sacrifice and loss? They became eager participants in the re-education program, consuming American books and newspapers, attending lectures, and eventually helping to produce anti-Nazi publications for distribution in camps after the war in Germany. These men were called anti-Fas by their fellow prisoners, short for anti-fascists. They risked violence from hardcore Nazis in the camps. Several prisoners in various American camps were murdered by fellow Germans for being too cooperative with captors or for expressing doubts about Nazi ideology. For others, the psychological adjustment was more gradual and ambiguous. They did not become ideological converts to American democracy, But they quietly abandoned their faith in Nazi ideology. They focused on survival, on maintaining connections with family at home, on trying to imagine a future after the war. They participated in the re-education programs, not out of conviction, but out of boredom or the promise of better treatment. They read American materials with skepticism, but also with curiosity. They were not converts, but neither were they true believers anymore. And for a minority, the cognitive dissonance was resolved by doubling down on Nazi ideology. These prisoners dismissed the evidence of their eyes, constructed elaborate explanations for American abundance and military success, and retreated into a fantasy world where Germany was still destined to win, and the propaganda must be true despite all evidence to the contrary. These were often the most dangerous. Prisoners, the ones who enforced Nazi discipline within the camps, who threatened or attacked doubters, who clung to Hitler as a drowning man clings to debris. The rodeo became a touchstone in conversations among prisoners. Remember how we didn't understand what we were seeing? Remember how it challenged what we thought we knew? Remember when we first began to doubt? For some prisoners, the rodeo was a joke evidence of American irrationality and waste. For others, it was a puzzle they kept returning to, trying to understand what it revealed about the nation that was defeating them. And for a few, it was a moment of clarity, when the ideological blinders fell away and they saw their enemy clearly for the first time. The historical record shows that American treatment of German POWs was remarkably effective at achieving its unstated objectives. Post-war surveys found that significant numbers of German prisoners returned home with more favorable views of the United States and democracy, and less favorable views of Nazi ideology. Some prisoners chose to return to America after repatriation to Germany, immigrating legally in the 1950s and becoming American citizens. The re-education program's effectiveness is debated by historians, but there is no question that exposure to American life had an impact on prisoner attitudes. The Rodeo incident, and the broader pattern of cultural confusion it represented, reveals something important about ideology and military culture in the Second World War. The German military was technically proficient, tactically skilled, and led by officers with extensive training and experience. But it served a totalitarian ideology that fundamentally misunderstood the nature of democratic societies. Nazi theorists believed that democracy was a weakness, that individualism undermined collective strength, that racial diversity prevented national unity. They believed that only through racial purity and totalitarian control could a nation achieve the unity necessary for modern warfare. The American experience proved them wrong. A diverse, individualistic, democratic society with a strong civilian culture proved perfectly capable of mobilizing for total war while maintaining the separations and freedoms that defined its character. Americans could attend rodeos and build aircraft carriers. They could celebrate individual achievement and coordinate massive military operations. They could maintain racial segregation that was morally indefensible, while also creating military units that fought effectively with men of all backgrounds. The contradictions that Nazi ideology claimed would destroy America instead turned out to be a source of adaptability and resilience. For the German prisoners at Camp Herne, the journey from ideological certainty to doubt played out against the backdrop of Germany's collapse. As 1944 progressed, into 1945, news from home became increasingly grim. Cities were being bombed into rubble. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied armies were advancing into Germany from east and west. Family letters, when they arrived at all, spoke of hunger, fear, and despair. The contrast between conditions in Germany and conditions in the Texas camps became impossible to ignore. Some prisoners felt guilty about their relative safety and abundance, while their families suffered. They had 3 meals a day, heated barracks, and no bombs falling on their heads. Meanwhile, their wives, children, and parents were enduring the final nightmare of the war's end. This guilt complicated the psychological adjustment process. Could they accept that their captors were right about Germany, about the Nazis, about the war, when doing so felt like a betrayal of the suffering people at home? Klaus Becker's final diary entry from his time at Camp Herne was written on May 8, 1925, Victory in Europe Day. He wrote, "Today the war ended. We received the news this morning. Some prisoners wept. Others seemed relieved. I do not know what I feel. Germany is defeated, occupied, destroyed. Everything we fought for is lost. And yet I find I cannot mourn for the cause. I think often of that rodeo we attended in October of '43. I did not understand what I was seeing. I thought it must serve some military purpose, because I could not imagine a nation doing anything that did not serve state power. The Americans have resources and strength because they have not sacrificed everything to the state. They have kept something for themselves, their ranches, their families, their foolish and dangerous entertainments. They are winning not despite these things, but perhaps because of them. A man who has something to return to will fight harder than a man who has only duty. We Germans were taught to sacrifice everything for the nation. The Americans sacrificed what was necessary and kept the rest. I think perhaps that is why they are standing and we have fallen. After the war, the German prisoners at Camp Hearn and other Texas camps were gradually repatriated between 1945 and 1947. The camps were dismantled, the buildings demolished or repurposed, the land returned to civilian use. But the impact of those years lingered. Some prisoners did return to the United States, seeking a new life in the country they had fought against, and then learned to understand. Others remained in Germany but carried with them memories of Texas, of abundance, of a different way of organizing society. The Texas prison rodeo continued until 1986, when structural problems with the stadium and changing attitudes about prisoner treatment led to its closure. It exists now only in photographs, memories, and historical records. The POW camps are gone too, marked by historical plaques and the occasional archaeological investigation. But the encounter between German prisoners and Texas rodeo culture represents a moment when ideology collided with reality, when propaganda met first-hand experience, and when men began the difficult process of questioning everything they thought they knew. The broader lesson of the story extends beyond the specific historical moment. Totalitarian ideologies, by their nature, must construct simplified narratives about reality. They must claim that their enemies are weak, degenerate, or doomed. They must insist that their own methods are the only path to strength and victory. They must deny the possibility that alternative social organizations might be equally or more effective. When these ideologies encounter reality, when their adherents actually meet the enemies they have been taught to despise, the cognitive dissonance can be profound. For the German prisoners who witnessed that rodeo in October of 1943, the dissonance began with a simpler misunderstanding. They thought they were observing military training when they were actually witnessing cultural tradition. But that initial confusion opened the door to larger questions about the nature of American society, about the reliability of Nazi propaganda, and ultimately about the war itself. Some prisoners walked through that door and never looked back. Others lingered at the threshold, uncertain and conflicted. And a few slammed it shut and refused to acknowledge what they had seen. The historical record cannot tell us exactly what each prisoner thought or felt. We have some diaries, some letters, some post-war interviews and memoirs. But for most of these men, their internal struggles remain private, known only to themselves and perhaps to their families. What we can say with certainty is that the encounter mattered, that it challenged assumptions and opened possibilities for change. In the midst of a war that killed tens of millions and destroyed entire civilizations, a few thousand men watched cowboys ride bulls in a Texas prison rodeo and began to question the ideology that had sent them to war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.